You are about to see these crashes exactly as they happened. Not in a reconstruction or a drawing, but in real footage, captured by the silent cameras that watch our runways, our streets, and our doorsteps day and night. Each of these aircraft was recorded in its final seconds, and each recording tells a story that words alone never could. Don't forget to subscribe to Terra Obscura. The airport security cameras caught something that almost never happens. As the cargo jet rotated for takeoff, its left engine tore away from the wing and flipped up over the top of the fuselage, tumbling back onto the runway behind it. The engine had not exploded or caught fire. It had simply ripped loose from the aircraft at the worst possible moment, and everything that followed was recorded frame by frame by the cameras watching the field. 34 years old and nearing the end of its working life, the McDonnell Douglas MD-11 had been loaded with more than 200,000 pounds of fuel for a long haul from Louisville to Hawaii. It carried 3 crew, and the takeoff looked completely normal at first. A witness in the control tower said the speed seemed right for the aircraft as it accelerated down the runway. It was only the climb that went wrong. At the moment of liftoff, the structure holding the left engine to the wing failed. This connection is called the pylon, a strong frame that carries the enormous forces an engine produces. On this aircraft, the fittings deep inside that pylon had been cracking for a long time, quietly and invisibly, until they could hold no longer. As the jet rotated, the left engine and its pylon tore free, arced up over the wing, and fell away behind. A fire ignited instantly where they had been attached, fed by fuel from the ruptured wing, and it burned without pause all the way to the ground. An MD-11 can fly on 2 engines. What it cannot easily survive is losing one so violently at the instant of takeoff, with a fire spreading across the wing and the aircraft only feet off the ground. The jet clawed into the air but could climb no higher than about 30 feet. It hung there for a moment, then rolled to the left and began to sink back toward the earth with nowhere left to go. Just beyond the end of the runway lay an industrial area, and the aircraft came down into it at speed. It struck a petroleum recycling facility and a UPS warehouse, carving a debris field half a mile long and setting off a blaze so large that the smoke was visible for miles across the city. The 3 crew members aboard died, along with 11 people on the ground. More than 20 others were injured. It was one of the worst accidents in the history of the cargo carrier. When investigators recovered the wreckage, they found the answer in 2 small structural fittings from the left pylon. Both had fractured, and the surfaces told a clear story. There was fatigue cracking, the slow spreading of tiny cracks over many flights, alongside signs that the weakened parts had finally been overstressed and broken through. The engine itself had been running perfectly when it separated. Nothing was wrong with it at all. The thing that failed was the structure meant to hold it in place, and it had been failing gradually for a long time before anyone could see it. What makes this crash so haunting is that it had happened before, in almost exactly the same way. In 1979, a McDonnell Douglas DC-10, the direct ancestor of this aircraft, lost its left engine and pylon during takeoff from Chicago. That jet rolled to the left and crashed, killing everyone aboard and 2 people on the ground, and it remains the deadliest aviation accident on American soil. The pylon design at the heart of both disasters shares the same basic lineage, and investigators looking into the Louisville crash pointed directly back to that earlier one. There is a harder detail still. The specific part that failed had a known history of trouble. Years before this crash, the manufacturer had issued a warning after several of these bearings fractured on other aircraft, some of them long before they were due for the inspections that might have caught the damage. The lesson of 1979 had been written in the worst possible ink, and decades later, a nearly identical failure cost 14 more lives. After Louisville, regulators grounded every aircraft of this type and its older siblings until each one could be inspected. The cameras that recorded the engine flipping over the wing gave investigators their first clue, and the wreckage confirmed the rest, that a machine can carry a hidden flaw for years and reveal it only when it is far too late. A large passenger aircraft hangs almost flat in the sky, its nose slightly down and its wings level, turning around and around like a leaf drifting off a tree. It does not dive or roll violently. It simply spins as it falls, slow and steady, all the way to the ground. Inside that aircraft were 62 people, and until the very last moments, the 2 pilots may not have grasped how much danger they were in. It was a routine domestic flight across southern Brazil, from Cascavel toward São Paulo, aboard a 14-year-old ATR-72, carrying 58 passengers and 4 crew. As the flight cruised at 17,000 feet, waiting for permission to begin its descent into the busy airspace ahead, it was flying through a sky full of ice. Ice is one of the oldest enemies in aviation. When an aircraft flies through cloud at the right temperature, water freezes onto its wings and changes their shape, and a wing that is the wrong shape stops producing lift the way it should. This particular aircraft was built to handle it. It had inflatable rubber boots on the wings to break the ice away, and sensors to warn the crew when ice was forming. During the flight, the crew switched the de-icing system on and off several times, and the first officer remarked at one point that there was a lot of ice, but the ice was building faster than they realized. The aircraft carried a monitoring system whose entire job was to watch how well it was flying and warn the crew if performance was slipping. In the minutes before the crash, it did exactly that, more than once. First, it warned that the cruising speed was dropping below where it should be. Then it warned of degraded performance, meaning the ice was now dragging heavily on the aircraft and stealing its speed. The crew acknowledged their instructions from air traffic control and kept flying, seemingly without understanding that the situation was becoming critical. Then they were cleared to descend and began a gentle turn. At that moment, the aircraft had slowed to just above the speed at which the wings would stop flying. A warning sounded that they needed more speed. A heartbeat later, the airframe began to shudder, and the stall alarm went off. The wings had given up. Loaded with ice and flying too slowly, they could no longer hold the aircraft in the air. Control was lost almost instantly. The aircraft rolled one way and then hard the other, swung through a turn and fell into a flat spin, rotating around 5 times as it dropped toward the earth at a tremendous rate. There was no recovering from it. The turboprop came down in the front garden of a house inside a gated community northwest of São Paulo and was consumed by fire. All 62 people aboard died. By a narrow mercy, no one on the ground was hurt. The most troubling part of the investigation was not the ice itself, which the crew could have escaped. The manufacturer's procedures for severe icing were clear. A crew was meant to keep their speed and power high and descend out of the icing, telling air traffic control at once. Had the crew followed those steps, the aircraft would very likely have flown out of the danger. They did not carry them out. They never declared an emergency or reported the conditions, and they appear not to have recognized how close to a stall the ice had brought them until it was too late to act. Investigators found the roots of that failure reached beyond the cockpit. Within the airline, warnings from the aircraft had gradually come to be treated as background noise, and problems that should have been fixed had quietly become normal. Records suggested the de-icing system on this very aircraft had shown trouble on earlier flights, yet those issues were never properly written up, so nothing was done about them. The danger of ice on this type of aircraft had been known for 30 years, ever since an almost identical loss of control had taken everyone aboard a similar turboprop in the United States. The lesson was old. What failed was the will to take it seriously, one skipped procedure and one unrecorded fault at a time. Almost everyone on this aircraft worked for the airline that owned it. They were the engineers and technicians who keep a small airline running, and that morning they were flying together to another city where their aircraft was due for maintenance. What brought them down was not bad luck or a freak failure. It was the way their own company did business, on full display in the space of a few seconds. The flight was a ferry flight, an empty repositioning trip with no paying passengers, carried out to move a Bombardier CRJ-200 from Kathmandu to a maintenance base in Pokhara. A ferry flight like this is not supposed to be full of people. This one carried 19, almost all of them airline staff hitching a ride to do the maintenance work at the other end. Under the rules, they should not have been aboard at all, but the airline treated its own procedures loosely, and no one objected. The problems began before the aircraft even moved. The takeoff speeds a crew uses are calculated from the aircraft's weight, and getting them right is essential, because they tell the pilots exactly how fast to be going before they lift the nose. On this flight, the numbers came from a speed card the airline had made itself, one that had never been properly checked and did not match the aircraft's real weight. The cargo made it worse. Boxes and equipment had been loaded by hand throughout the aircraft, much of it unsecured and some of it flammable, with no proper check of how the weight was distributed. The captain, who was also the airline's head of operations, was flying. As the CRJ accelerated down the runway and reached the moment to take off, he pulled the nose up too soon and far too sharply. The proper rate to raise the nose is gentle, only a few degrees each second. He rotated it more than double that, hauling the nose skyward while the aircraft was still slower than it should have been. The result was immediate and unrecoverable. Pulling the nose up that fast, at that lowest speed, drove the wings to an angle where they could no longer produce lift. The aircraft staggered into the air, and the stall warning fired within 2 seconds of leaving the ground, at a height of barely 11 feet. There was only one way out, which was to lower the nose and let the wings fly again, but there was no room to do it. The CRJ was already stalling a few feet above the runway. It rolled sharply one way and then the other, and its right wing struck the ground. The aircraft slid off the side of the runway, struck a container and broke apart as it came to rest, bursting into flames. Of the 19 people aboard, 18 died. The only survivor was the captain, pulled from the wreckage of the cockpit with serious injuries. The people in the cabin behind him, his own colleagues, did not get out. The most sobering part of the investigation was that none of this was a surprise waiting to happen. It had been happening for months, in plain sight, in the aircraft's own recorded data. The captain had a habit of raising the nose too quickly on takeoff, and the flight recorders had captured him doing it again and again over the preceding year, sometimes at rates nearly as dangerous as the one that brought the aircraft down. Any competent monitoring program would have flagged it long before, and someone could have quietly corrected him. But the airline had no such program, so the warnings piled up unseen, flight after flight. In the end, the habit met a badly loaded aircraft and a set of wrong numbers, and there was no margin left to absorb it. The regulator, meant to catch all of this, had waved the flight through, without the checks its own rules demanded. 18 of the airline's own people paid for that with their lives, aboard an aircraft they had trusted because it belonged to the company they worked for. The most basic thing a pilot must do before landing is put the wheels down. On this flight, that never happened. And the reason it never happened is one of the strangest and most disturbing stories in modern aviation. It is not a story of bad weather or broken machinery. The aircraft was in perfect working order. The sky over Karachi was clear, and the crew were experienced. What brought this flight down was a slow collapse of basic discipline in the cockpit, one ignored warning at a time until nearly 100 people were gone. It was May of 2020, and the pandemic was the thing on everyone's mind. As the Airbus A320 cruised toward Karachi with 99 people aboard, the two pilots fell into a long and easy conversation about the virus and the toll it was taking. That talk went on far past the point where it should have stopped. Below 10,000 feet, pilots are meant to keep to business only, so that nothing distracts them from the approach. These two never made that switch. They never held the briefing where a crew walks through the landing together, and because they skipped it, they missed a small setting buried in their flight computer that was quietly about to ruin their arrival. The result was that the aircraft came toward the airport far too high. When the crew finally lined up with the runway, they found themselves at nearly twice the altitude they should have been, with very little distance left to lose it. This was the moment to give up, circle around, and try again. Air traffic control expected them to do exactly that. Instead, the captain decided to force the landing, and to lose all that extra height, he threw the aircraft into a dive so steep it defied belief. To come down fast enough, the crew did things no airline pilot should ever do on an approach. They pulled the engines back to idle and pointed the nose sharply at the ground. They put out every device that could add drag, and at one point they even lowered the landing gear purely to slow themselves down, then raised it again later. The jet was soon falling at more than 7,000 feet a minute, a rate you would expect from an emergency dive, not a routine landing. Warning after warning went off in the cockpit. An alarm for flying too fast sounded again and again, and the crew silenced it rather than fix it. A computer voice called out that they were sinking too fast and told them to pull up. They pressed on. All the while, the controller was trying to save them from themselves. He told them plainly that they were too high. He offered them a circle to lose altitude. When they brushed him off, he gave them a direct order to turn away and stop the approach. The crew ignored it. One of them told him they were comfortable, that they could make it, and they kept diving toward the runway. By the point where any sane approach must be stable and ready to land, this one met not a single one of the requirements. The aircraft was far too high and far too fast, its checklist undone, and its landing gear still tucked away, and no one in the cockpit called for the one thing that would have saved them, a go-around. So the A320 crossed the runway threshold still going far too fast, and settled onto the concrete with its wheels up. The undersides of both engines hit the runway and began to grind along it, throwing up long showers of sparks, the sound of metal being torn away carrying across the airfield. For 18 seconds, the jet slid down the runway on its engines, the captain instinctively pressing brakes that were not there, the engines being ground open beneath him. In the control tower, a controller watched the whole thing in disbelief. He saw the sparks and the raised gear, and understood at once what had happened. He phoned the approach controller to report it, but that message was never passed to the crew. Whether it would have changed anything is doubtful, because of what the pilots did next. Rather than stay on the ground, they decided to take off again. They pushed the throttles forward and hauled the crippled jet back into the sky. It was the choice that sealed their fate, though it is not clear they could have stopped safely on the runway anyway. Sliding on its belly, the aircraft had barely slowed, and its engines were now mortally wounded. The long grind along the runway had torn open the oil lines inside both of them. An engine without oil has only minutes to live, and both of these had been running without it since the moment they touched the ground. As the jet climbed away and turned back for another try, first one engine failed. Then, after a confused moment in which the crew cut power to the wrong engine entirely, the other began to die as well. Now the aircraft was a glider, low over a dense neighborhood, with no engines and no way to reach the runway. It slowed, its nose rising as the crew fought to stretch the glide, and the stall warning began to sound. The captain called out a mayday. Seconds later, it came down in line with a narrow residential street, clipping rooftops in a district called Model Colony, barely a kilometer short of the runway and only a block from open ground. A wing struck a building, and the aircraft came apart in a burst of fire, scattering wreckage down the street and into the tightly packed houses. Of the 99 people aboard, only 2 survived, both pulled from the rubble by neighbors who rushed in against the flames. One of them had been thrown clear, still strapped into his seat. On the ground, the toll could have been far worse, because it was a Friday during Ramadan, and most of the men were away at prayer. Still, people were hurt. Among them, 3 young sisters cleaning an apartment the aircraft struck. The youngest of them, a girl of 13, died of her burns days later. When investigators finally reconstructed the flight, they found no single failure to blame, because the failure was total. The crew had skipped their call-outs and checklists and ignored nearly every warning the aircraft could produce. They had disobeyed clear instructions from the ground and refused every chance the controller gave them to break off and try again. It stood among the worst displays of airmanship ever recorded on a large airliner, and the hardest question was how 2 licensed pilots could fly this way at all. Part of the answer lay in the men themselves, one overconfident and dismissive, the other a weak pilot who had barely passed his training. But the deeper answer lay in the airline behind them, a national carrier so tangled in politics and patronage that safety had long since stopped being the point. This captain had flown wild approaches like this one before, and nothing in the system had ever stopped him. What happened over Karachi was not a sudden failure. It was what happens when a cockpit answers to no one, and no one is watching to notice. A pilot reached up to turn on a switch and turned off the wrong one. It was a small movement in a dark cockpit, the kind a pilot makes without looking 1,000 times in a career. But on this night, the 2 switches he wanted sat directly above the 2 he touched by mistake, and that single error of the hand began a chain that would end with an aircraft in the front garden of a house. The flight was a cargo run in the dead of night, a Boeing 737 freighter flying from Germany to Lithuania on behalf of a global delivery company. The aircraft was old, more than 30 years, built as a passenger jet in the early 1990s and later converted to carry freight. 4 people were aboard, 2 pilots and 2 others, working the quiet overnight hours when most of Europe was asleep. The weather at the destination was cold and overcast, the kind of night where a crew would want their anti-icing systems running. That is what the captain was reaching for. He went to switch on the heating that keeps ice off the engines, but the controls he actually moved were the ones just below, which powered one of the aircraft's 2 hydraulic systems. He shut it down without realizing, and he never turned the anti-icing on at all. From that moment, the aircraft was flying with only half its hydraulic power, and the crew did not know it. The consequences stayed hidden until the approach. As the aircraft descended toward the runway, the crew called for the flaps, the panels on the wings that let a jet fly slowly enough to land. The lever moved, but the flaps did not, because the hydraulic system that drives them was dead. The aircraft was now committed to an approach it could not fly properly, coming in too fast and in the wrong shape to land, and the crew was slow to grasp why. Then a second problem stacked on top of the first. Handed off to the control tower for landing, the crew tuned their radio to the wrong frequency and could not reach anyone. The tower, unable to raise them, transmitted its landing clearance into an empty channel without knowing whether the aircraft could hear it. In these final minutes, working a failing approach in the dark and out of contact with the ground, the crew let the aircraft sink below the path that would have carried it safely to the runway. By the time the first officer noticed that the flaps had never extended, there were seconds left. An automated voice called out that the ground was too close. A moment later, the aircraft struck the earth just under a mile short of the runway, tearing into a 2-story house on the edge of the airport and catching fire. The captain was killed. The other 3 aboard were badly hurt, but survived. Remarkably, no one inside the house was hurt, and every resident got out safely. This crash is a study in how small things combine. No single mistake here was the kind that dooms an aircraft on its own. Each one was survivable, and a crew that had caught the dead hydraulics in time, or pulled up from the low approach, would very likely have gone around and lived. What made this flight fatal was the way the errors lined up. one behind another, in the small hours of the morning, when fatigue is heaviest and attention is thinnest. At the time of writing, the official investigation is still not finished, the work of fitting every piece together into a final answer. But the outline is already clear enough that a routine delivery flight was brought down by a handful of ordinary mistakes, none of them caught until it was too late. This is one of the few crashes in this video with no explanation. There is no disputed theory here and no complicated chain of events. There is simply no explanation at all. 40 seconds after taking off into a dark and cloudy sky, a small jet pitched over and dove almost straight down into a city neighborhood, and to this day, no one can say for certain why. The one device that might have told us fell silent years before anyone realized it. A Learjet 55, more than 40 years old. The aircraft had been fitted out as a flying ambulance and had come to Philadelphia to carry a patient home. Aboard were 2 pilots and 2 medical staff. In their care was a child who had spent months in a Philadelphia hospital being treated for a serious illness, now flying home with her mother at last. 6 people in all, on the first leg of a long journey back to Mexico. The weather that evening was poor, a low overcast with mist and light rain, the sort of night when a crew flies entirely on their instruments. The jet lifted off from the runway and climbed away to the southwest, turning gently as it went. For about half a minute, everything was normal. The crew spoke briefly to the control tower and gave no sign of any trouble. Whatever went wrong left them no time even to call for help. At around 1,600 feet, barely a third of a mile up, the aircraft stopped climbing and dropped. It did not descend gradually or spiral down. It went over into a steep dive, nose down at more than 20 degrees, and accelerated hard toward the ground as its speed climbed. In seconds, it was plunging at a rate no aircraft is meant to survive. A doorbell camera on a nearby house caught the final moment, the jet appearing out of the low cloud in a near vertical dive, streaking down behind a row of rooftops. An instant later came a brilliant flash and a fireball that rose above the houses. The aircraft struck a commercial area near a shopping mall and disintegrated, scattering burning wreckage across a stretch of ground more than a quarter-mile long, into the buildings and cars below. Everyone on the jet was lost. On the ground, a man in his car died in the fire, and more than 20 other people were hurt. What makes this crash so hard to accept is that the trail of evidence goes cold at the worst possible place. A jet of this size is required to carry a cockpit voice recorder, and this one had it. Investigators dug the device out from 8 feet down in the impact crater and carefully repaired it, hoping it would reveal what the pilots saw and said in those final seconds. When they played it back, there was nothing. The recorder had not captured the accident at all, and had most likely not been recording anything for years. The one witness that might have explained the dive had been dead long before the aircraft was. So the questions remain open. Whether an engine failed or a control jammed in the dark, no one has been able to say with certainty. The investigation is still going, working from twisted wreckage and a few seconds of doorbell footage, trying to reconstruct what a broken recorder should have handed them outright. There is a particular cruelty to this one, beyond even the loss of 6 lives and a bystander on the ground. A child had come through months of illness and treatment and was finally going home, and the aircraft carrying her fell out of the sky for reasons that may never be fully known. 2 pilots died in this crash. The remarkable thing is that no one else did, and that was their doing. In the last half minute of their lives, with both engines dead and a business jet turning into a heavy glider, they steered it down onto one of the busiest highways in Florida at rush hour and put it on the pavement without killing a single person on the ground. The aircraft was a Bombardier Challenger, a mid-size private jet, returning to Naples in the late afternoon after a flight up to Ohio and back. Aboard were 2 pilots, a flight attendant, and 2 passengers. The approach was ordinary until the aircraft was a few miles from the airport, low and slowing for landing. Then, in the space of about 7 seconds, a rapid series of warnings lit up the cockpit, one after another, telling the crew that the oil pressure in both engines was failing. What followed was the situation every pilot dreads and few ever face. Both engines lost power at almost the same instant, and at their low altitude, there was no way to restart them. The crew radioed the tower with the kind of words no controller wants to hear, that they had lost both engines and were going down. They had been cleared to land, but they already knew the runway was out of reach. The jet was gliding now, dropping toward a landscape of houses and roads with only seconds of flight left in it. Directly ahead lay a wide interstate highway, packed with Friday afternoon traffic. It was the only open strip long enough to hold an aircraft, and the pilots aimed for it. A driver's dash cam caught the final seconds. The Challenger coming down in a shallow turn, leveling its wings, and settling onto the southbound lanes as if trying to land in traffic. It touched down among the moving cars, ran along the road, and clipped two vehicles before veering onto the shoulder and striking a concrete sound barrier where it came apart and caught fire. Both pilots were killed in the impact and the blaze that followed, but the fire took the front of the aircraft first, and in the back, 3 people were still alive. The cabin doors were blocked by flames, so the flight attendant and the 2 passengers made their way to the very rear of the cabin and escaped through the baggage compartment door, getting clear of the burning wreck. On the highway, considering an airliner had just landed among moving traffic, the harm was astonishingly small. A few drivers hurt and shaken, and no one on the ground lost. It took 2 years of investigation to explain why the engines quit, and the answer was corrosion. Deep inside both engines, in a system that controls the airflow through them, metal parts had corroded in a way consistent with exposure to salt air, and that corrosion choked off the engine's ability to make power. The cruelest detail is that the trouble had shown itself before. Weeks earlier, the aircraft had suffered a strange engine problem on startup, and mechanics had spent days looking into it, draining fuel and testing it and swapping filters, even consulting the engine maker. They found nothing wrong and returned the jet to service. The corrosion that would kill the crew was already there, hidden where their inspection could not reach it. What stays with people about this crash is the choice the pilots made with the seconds they had. They could not save themselves. Once both engines died that low, their own survival was almost certainly beyond reach. What they could still control was where the aircraft came down, and they spent their final moments guiding it onto the one place that gave everyone else a chance. A jet fell onto a crowded American highway at rush hour, and the only people who did not walk away from it were the 2 men at the controls who made sure the rest could. Every crash in this video shares one thing, and it is not a cause. These aircraft were brought down by very different things: a cracked engine mount, a wing full of ice, a switch touched in error, a mistake that no one ever explained. What they have in common is that a camera was watching. 20 years ago, almost none of these final moments would have been recorded at all. Today, a doorbell, a traffic camera, a phone raised by a stranger, they see what once vanished the instant it happened. And nearly every crash here is recent, from the last few years alone, which tells you how quickly this has become the world we live in. That has changed what these disasters leave behind. For most of aviation history, when an aircraft came down, the only witnesses were the people who did not survive it. Investigators worked backward from wreckage and recorders, reconstructing a story no living person had seen. Now there is often an image of the thing itself: the engine tumbling over the wing, the flat spin, the steep dive out of the cloud. A few seconds of footage can tell investigators in an afternoon what the metal might have taken months to reveal. But the camera has limits, and this video shows those too. It sees the outside of an aircraft, never the inside. It caught the Learjet falling into a Philadelphia neighborhood, yet the recorder that should have captured the cockpit had been silent for years, and the reason for that dive may never be known. A lens can show you that an aircraft dropped from the sky. It cannot always tell you why, and the why is the only thing that keeps it from happening again. There is something uneasy, too, in how easily we can now watch these moments. A crash that once existed only as a line in a report is now something anyone can replay, over and over, from the comfort of a screen. It is worth remembering as we watch that every one of these clips holds the last seconds of real people's lives. The aircraft in the footage was full of passengers who had packed their bags that morning and expected to open them again somewhere else. The camera turns those final moments into something we can pause and rewind, and there is a quiet duty that comes with that, to look with some care rather than only curiosity. Look past the aircraft in these clips, and you see the ordinary world it fell into. Cars stopped at a light, a bus full of people on their way to work, houses with the lights on. Most of the dead in this video were on the aircraft, but the danger never stayed neatly in the sky, and again it reached the people below who had no idea it was coming. And yet those same people are the reason many of these stories are not even darker. That may be the most important thing the cameras record. They show us how an aircraft fails, and they show us just as clearly how people respond when one falls in front of them. 2 pilots spent their last seconds guiding a powerless jet down onto a crowded highway without taking anyone else with them. Passengers climbed out of an aircraft lying upside down and on fire, and every one of them walked away. On more than one of these streets, strangers ran toward the burning wreckage instead of away from it, pulling people out with their bare hands. The footage captures the worst thing that can happen in the air, and right beside it, some of the best of what people do on the ground. These crashes were caught on camera so that the rest of us could learn from them, and that is worth doing. Every one of them has already changed something, an inspection, a procedure, a warning that will sound a little sooner on some future flight. The footage is hard to watch, but it is also the reason the next aircraft in the same situation may never become a video at all. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe to Terra Obscura.